And so the notion of a public good might seem a little straightforward. We just think that something that government makes, that must be a public good. Well, as usual, economists get a little more finicky about the definition, so we can correct you and act like we're ever so smart. So a public good turns out is a very specific thing. And what on earth does this definition mean? It's non-rival and non-excludable? And it has to be both? Well, yes. So what do these words mean? Well, rivality means if you're using something, then it makes somebody else's ability to use it worse. If you go to the movies, which we're not allowed to do anymore, but maybe someday, and there's only one person in a very large theater sitting somewhere in the back, and you prefer to sit up front, your consumption of that movie isn't affecting them. Their consumption of that movie isn't affecting you. It's non-rival in consumption at that point. Meanwhile, food is very rival in consumption. I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out why. Give you a hint, gross. So some goods and services are non-rival in consumption, which can lead to various issues in which things will break down, markets will fail, etc. And as far as non-excludability is concerned, this is basically the big beefy bouncer at the nightclub who's keeping you out. You want to go in, but they're just not letting you in unless you're on the list or you stand in line forever or whatever. So you can be prevented from using something. Of course, that's somewhat of an extreme example. You can be prevented from using whatever's being sold at the local convenience store. Of course, you can also go in, pick it up, and run out and maybe get away with it. The point here is laws are strict enough, police are good enough at what they do to where it's a big enough risk of having to pay a huge penalty if you try to steal something that's highly excludable to where you can be excluded from using it. But there are plenty of things, services, goods, or whatever, where there's really no way to stop anybody from using it. Think of the ocean. That's a pretty private beaches are excludable, but the ocean itself, you just go around a private beach to another way of getting into the ocean. You swim around in the ocean all you want. Nobody can stop you. It's too big. And it's also not very rival. A crowded private beach can be rival in consumption, but the ocean at large is just way too big for all the human beings on Earth to be able to get in everybody's way if we spread out and use the ocean at large. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, a big example of this is fish in the open sea. A lot of you might be aware of some problems associated with overfishing. It's called the tragedy of the commons. If something is non-rival and non-excludable, again, you can go out on large bodies of water where it's difficult to police the whole thing. You can go out onto the ocean and you can fish, and once the fish are gone, they're gone. So it's rival in consumption because there are only so many fish to catch. So once you run up against the limit of how many fish are there, then you find yourself in a place where there are some problems here. There's going to be overconsumption, and it's going to be costly for everybody. So it's not excludable and it's rivalrous, so fish are a public good. They're not provided by any government. This is why I said it's not quite things that are provided by government, not necessarily. And in fact, some things provided by government are not necessarily public goods, like if the government runs a museum, but they can keep you out unless you pay them, then that is excludable, even though it's being provided by the government, and it's not a pure public good. Streaming services are examples of non-pure public goods because they are excludable, but they're definitely not rival in consumption. So if there's no way to keep people from hacking into Netflix, then it becomes a public good even if it's privately produced. And there are some problems that will come up. So fireworks shows are another very frequent examples you see in economics of something where you're generally going to have the government provide it, because it's very difficult to make a profit off of it. You can't stop people from watching a fireworks show. People want it, but no one can stop anybody from seeing it. So it's non-excludable and it's non-rivalrous. You're looking up in the sky, other people are looking up in the sky. There's plenty of fireworks shows can be seen from miles around, so you can view the thing from many different places. So this brings us to the free rider problem. If you can't exclude people from consuming something, then why on earth are you going to produce it? Production is costly. Remember, no free lunch. You have to put time and effort and raw materials and all sorts of things into producing anything. And what do you get out of it? Well, maybe you get a good feeling because you made something for somebody, but not a whole lot of production happens if that's all we get. So the free rider problem applies to a lot of things. Think about national defense. You can't really only defend the country for whoever is paying for the military. You either defend the whole country or you don't defend it. Another example that comes up in economics a lot has to do with walls that you build to keep in coastal areas to keep floods from rushing into a neighborhood. You either build the wall and everybody's protected from floodwaters, or you don't build it and nobody is protected. You can't have it both ways. So you think about anybody in such a situation, you want the benefits, but so does everybody else. If you don't pay for it, no one can stop you from enjoying the benefits. So why would you pay for it? This is kind of the basic justification that economists will give for taxation. And that is one of the solutions. But sell advertising to firms, that's also on this solutions slide. Because you think about internet websites, like Google is the more obvious one, or YouTube, or something like that. I'm sure Google would love it if you had to pay them every time you watch something on YouTube. But there are only certain circumstances with copyrighted material or ad-free viewing that some people are willing to pay for. For the most part, if they make you pay for everything, nobody's going to watch it. Nobody's going to use it, and producing it would be a big waste of time. However, you sell advertising. Radio is, of course, I'm using a newfangled example, but you go back 100 years, you can't stop people from listening to the radio, talk about something that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. You figure out how to make an antenna, you get the equipment, you listen to the radio all day. How does anybody profit off of that? Well, we know. You sell advertising to firms, and there is an incentive for somebody to pay for everybody else's use. And then, of course, developing technologies to bypass the non-excludability of something like a web page. You develop the technology to make sure that nobody can hack in and keep everybody out unless they pay for the right to have a password. Then you're able to add excludability, and then you can charge people. So those are some options that can exist for non-government entities, but oftentimes we need this first one where the government will fund the service and tax people don't use it. Now there's an interesting thing that comes up when you have externalities going on. People who aren't party to a transaction are being affected, or even if it's not a transaction, it's just one person's doing something and it's bothering somebody else, like you have a tree growing on your property and it's overgrowing onto your neighbor's property and they want you to cut it down, but you love that tree. What do? Well, we have what is known as the Coase theorem. And it's called the Coase theorem because it was developed by a lawyer whose last name was Coase. And this is yet another of the many examples I've pointed out about how economics is a profession where the Nobel Prize for Economics is given to non-economists. Hey, you got a good idea, you can get a prize too. So Ronald Coase is a lawyer who recognized you need a couple of things. You need some pretty stringent stuff. Property rights need to be very clear and well understood. So the case of a tree growing on someone's property, you know where the property line begins and ends, and they're very well defined. The transaction costs of negotiations have to be low. and then a mutually beneficial agreement has to be reached. So, property rights are well defined, transaction costs are low. This means you can go to your neighbor and say, I'd like you to cut down your tree. Or your neighbor can go to you and say so. And you can say, yeah, but I don't want to. So your neighbor can think, you know what? I would pay $1,000 for that tree to get cut down, and I'm willing to do it. And you might think, just without saying it out loud, dude, you give me $200, I'll cut it down, no problem. But I'm not going to cut it down for free. If the neighbor offers you $1,000, it's a low transaction cost. You don't need lawyers. He just says, here, $1,000 if you cut it down, and we're good. And you'll think, well, maybe you'll say, well, maybe, I don't know, you'll hem and haw a little bit. But of course, you're thinking, boy, I hit the mother load. I'd cut it down for $200. The problem is solved without any government intervention. That's the idea of the Coase theorem, and it happens sometimes. But again, you need these very strict things. You need private property rights to be very well understood and clearly defined, and you need the transaction costs to be low. If the transaction costs are high, you need to get lawyers involved. You need to get the government involved, and the Coase theorem doesn't necessarily work. And then again, if you're saying, hey, that tree's on my property, no, it's on my property, no, it's on my, that's not going to work, and you need to get the government involved. This is just a way in which some of these deals can be handled without government involvement. So to sum it all up, costs and benefits need to be in a range where everybody is. Oh, yeah, when an externality exists, if the cost or benefit, yeah, I'm not even reading the slide. If a cost or a benefit is received by someone who isn't involved in producing or consuming something, then it's an externality. And if property rights aren't clearly defined or enforced, then that's often a justification for government getting involved. If someone does own private property and it's clearly defined and somebody is affecting their private property, then it's a little bit easier to get something done. But it's very important to have clearly defined property rights, and transaction costs need to be low if we're going to have a smooth, easy way of handling things without getting the government involved. So, very, very brief introduction to all of this stuff. Very much a bird's eye view. All of these have much deeper analyses that get very interesting. And as I often do, I encourage you to continue studying economics. It's a very rich and interesting and multifaceted topic, even if it doesn't necessarily seem like it. Going forward in economics does not always involve the kinds of ways in which we look at things. So even if you still have your heart set on another major, it's a good thing to double major in, or at least minor in. It looks good on a resume, and you learn a lot of stuff that even if you never use it, you're never going to regret knowing. So I've enjoyed having this class, and hope you guys enjoy your summer.